Elderly mother visits her daughter and opens the door to find something that leaves her in shock. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Linda, an elderly woman with a delicate appearance but an unyielding spirit, pulled her heavy coat tight against the cold morning wind. She clutched her worn handbag in one hand, filled with small, useful items she had learned to carry throughout her life. In her other hand was a folded, yellowed letter. It was from her daughter, Julia, sent months ago, filled with words of joy and promises to visit. Since then, there had been nothing but silence. Linda had called repeatedly, but no one answered. Her maternal instincts told her something was wrong. Julia's mansion was an impressive sight. Built in a Victorian style, it stood atop a hill like a looming figure against the overcast sky. Its Gothic contours, with tall spires and narrow windows, resembled vigilant eyes. The rusted iron gate creaked as Linda pushed it open, the sound echoing through the expansive garden. Ancient, well-kept trees lined the path, but something felt off about the scene. One of the bushes was scorched, as if something unusual had happened recently, and a few flowers wilted despite the meticulous landscaping. Linda was greeted at the front door by Jessica, the housekeeper. The woman was thin, with small, expressionless eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Her posture was stiff, almost as if guarding a secret. Linda studied her closely as the woman explained that Julia was resting and couldn't see her at the moment. Jessica's words were polite, but her unease was evident. Linda insisted on coming inside, saying she had traveled a long way to see her daughter. As she stepped through the door, Linda felt a chill. The mansion's interior was grand, with a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling and elegantly curved staircases leading to the second floor. But the air felt heavy, as though something dark lingered there. The walls displayed paintings of bucolic landscapes, yet their tones were dull, almost mournful. Jessica led Linda to the living room, a large space furnished with period pieces, but the faint smell of mold and the distant sound of footsteps upstairs unsettled her. Jessica offered tea, but Linda declined, watching discreetly as the housekeeper left the room. Alone, Linda's eyes roamed the space. A photo frame on the coffee table caught her attention. It held a picture of Julia and George, Linda's son-in-law. Something about Julia's expression seemed wrong. Her smile appeared forced, and her once bright eyes seemed shadowed, as if they carried an invisible burden. George entered the room shortly afterward, his presence filling the space. He was a tall man with a confident demeanor and an impeccable appearance. His tailored suit seemed almost calculated to impress, but there was something artificial about his cordiality. His voice was low and measured as he greeted Linda, but his lack of enthusiasm was evident. When Linda directly asked about Julia, he responded casually, saying she had been sleeping a lot lately, recovering from a stressful period. Something in his words made Linda's heart clench. Determined to stay longer at the mansion to assess the situation, Linda claimed to be tired and asked to spend the night. George hesitated but eventually agreed, clearly uneasy with the idea. As Jessica led Linda to the guest room, she felt as if she were stepping into a realm of uncertainties, where dark secrets seemed to lurk in every shadow. Linda placed her handbag on the guest room's modest dresser and sat on the edge of the neatly made bed. The room was quiet, too quiet, with only the faint ticking of a small clock breaking the silence. She gazed out the window, her eyes tracing the outlines of the garden below. The neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant flowers looked peaceful from a distance, but Linda's unease persisted. She noticed a figure moving near the farthest hedge, Charles, the gardener, carefully pruning a rose bush. There was something unspoken in his slow, deliberate movements. She turned her attention to the room. Despite its pristine appearance, it felt cold, devoid of warmth or personality. A faint, stale scent lingered in the air, like a place that had been cleaned too often but never truly lived in. Linda opened the small closet out of curiosity and found it empty. Strange, she thought, for a home as large as this one to have unused rooms. It gave the mansion an eerie hollowness. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew her attention. She quickly closed the closet and pretended to adjust her scarf as the door creaked open slightly. Jessica peeked inside, her expression unreadable. "Is everything to your liking, Mrs. Linda?" she asked in a voice that sounded rehearsed. "Yes, thank you," Linda replied, matching Jessica's tone with polite indifference. Jessica lingered for a moment too long, her eyes scanning the room as though looking for something out of place. Then, with a nod, she closed the door softly behind her. Linda exhaled deeply and reached for her phone. There was no signal. Later that evening, Linda joined George and Jessica for dinner in the grand dining hall. The table was long, with an ornate centerpiece of white lilies that filled the room with a sweet yet overpowering fragrance. George sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding, while Jessica moved with precision, serving the meal. Linda noticed the absence of Julia's place setting. "She's still resting," George said, as if reading Linda's thoughts. He cut into his steak with measured precision, his eyes avoiding Linda's. "I see," Linda replied, her voice calm but probing. "She must be very tired to miss dinner." George smiled, a thin, practiced gesture. "Her health comes first. She'll join us when she's ready." Linda let the silence hang, observing the two carefully. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she poured George's wine. A moment later, Linda noticed a small vial peeking out of Jessica's apron pocket. It was subtle, but enough to stoke her suspicions further. "Jessica," Linda said abruptly, her voice firm. "I'd like to see Julia tonight. Perhaps I could bring her some tea myself." Jessica froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. "Oh, that won't be necessary, ma'am. I'll attend to her personally." George interjected smoothly, "We appreciate your concern, Linda, but Julia needs her rest. You'll see her in the morning, I'm sure." Linda didn't press further but made a mental note to visit Julia's room later, regardless of their objections. After dinner, Linda excused herself and pretended to retire to her room. Instead, she waited until the house was quiet, her ears tuned to every creak and murmur. Around midnight, she stepped into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door to Julia's room was slightly ajar, and Linda peered inside cautiously. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp. Julia lay on the bed, her face pale and her breath shallow. Beside her was a tray with a teacup and a small bottle of pills. Linda's heart sank. She stepped inside quietly, kneeling beside her daughter. "Julia," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Julia stirred slightly but didn't wake. Linda examined the pills and the faint smell of the tea, her unease turning into certainty. Something was terribly wrong. Linda's heart raced as she carefully inspected the tray by Julia's bedside. The teacup had a faint residue at the bottom, it smelled bitter and chemical. She picked up the bottle of pills, noting the unfamiliar label. Quietly, she slipped it into her pocket. A wave of protectiveness surged through her as she looked at her daughter, frail and vulnerable. Suddenly, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway froze her in place. Linda extinguished the lamp and crouched in the shadows, holding her breath. A moment later, Jessica entered the room, her silhouette framed by the faint light spilling in from the hallway. She carried another tray, this time with a steaming teapot and a cup. Jessica set the tray on the bedside table and leaned close to Julia, her movements precise yet cold. Linda's hands clenched into fists as she watched the housekeeper pour a cup of tea and stir in a powder from a small packet she had tucked into her apron. Jessica's expression betrayed nothing, but her actions spoke volumes. Linda waited until Jessica left, closing the door behind her, before emerging from the shadows. She sniffed the fresh cup of tea and recoiled at the acrid scent. It was unmistakable, Julia was being drugged. Linda knew she couldn't confront George or Jessica yet. She needed proof, something undeniable. Quietly, she slipped out of Julia's room and returned to the guest room. There, she placed the pills and the packet Jessica had used into a small pouch she kept in her handbag. Her mind raced with possibilities. The next morning, Linda rose early and ventured into the garden, pretending to enjoy the crisp morning air. Charles, the gardener, was tending to the rose bushes near the edge of the property. She approached him casually, her steps careful to avoid drawing attention from anyone watching from the mansion. "Good morning," she greeted, her tone light but purposeful. Charles looked up, wiping his hands on a cloth. His face was weathered, but his eyes held a warmth that immediately set Linda at ease. "Morning, ma'am. Out for some fresh air?" Linda nodded, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Yes. But I was hoping to ask you something. You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Charles hesitated, then nodded. "A few years now. I take care of the grounds, keep things in order." Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? About Julia or the others?" Charles's brow furrowed, and he looked around nervously before responding. "I've seen things, ma'am. Things that don't sit right with me. Miss Julia used to come out here often, always full of life. Now, I haven't seen her in weeks. And Mr. George and that housekeeper, Jessica, they're always whispering about something. Something I don't think Miss Julia would agree with." Linda felt a glimmer of hope. "Charles, I think Julia is in danger. I need your help. Can you keep an eye out? Let me know if you see or hear anything unusual." Charles nodded firmly. "I'll do what I can, ma'am. For Miss Julia." Feeling reassured, Linda returned to the house with a renewed sense of determination. But as she stepped through the front door, she was met with George's piercing gaze. "You're up early," he remarked, his voice smooth but with an edge of suspicion. Linda smiled calmly. "I've always been an early riser. Just enjoying the garden." George's lips curled into a thin smile, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm sure you'll find everything here to your liking. Do let me know if you need anything." As he walked away, Linda felt the weight of his words. He knew she was watching, and she had to tread carefully. Later that day, Linda decided to search George's study. She waited until both George and Jessica were occupied in the kitchen. With Charles discreetly keeping watch, Linda slipped into the study. The room was dark and imposing, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk. She rifled through drawers, careful not to disturb their arrangement. Finally, she found a locked drawer. Using a small hairpin from her bag, she picked the lock with trembling hands. Inside, she discovered a stack of documents. Her breath caught as she read through them. They detailed George's plans to access Julia's wealth, including her shares in several lucrative companies. One letter, half-written, revealed plans to commit her to a private facility, citing mental instability as the reason. Linda's hands shook with anger. She photographed the documents with her phone, ensuring she had evidence. Before leaving, she carefully returned everything to its place. As she exited the study, she heard George's voice from the hallway. She ducked into a nearby closet, holding her breath. George's footsteps passed by, and she silently thanked her luck. Back in her room, Linda reviewed the photos. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Julia's life was at stake, and Linda knew she had little time to act. Linda's mind was racing as she carefully hid the phone containing the photographs. She tucked it deep into the lining of her handbag, making sure it was secure. The evidence she had gathered was damning, but she needed a plan, one that would save Julia and ensure George and Jessica faced justice. Later that evening, Linda found herself at the dinner table again. The tension was palpable, though George's demeanor remained calculatedly calm. Jessica served the meal, her hands steady now, her mask of composure firmly in place. Linda, however, couldn't help but notice the subtle glances they exchanged, as if silently communicating. George broke the silence. You seem restless today, Linda. Is everything all right? Linda met his gaze without flinching. I'm just worried about Julia. I still haven't had much time with her. He gave a thin smile. As I said, she needs her rest. These things take time. Linda nodded, concealing her frustration. She decided it was better not to provoke him, at least not yet. Instead, she shifted the conversation. Your home is impressive, George. I couldn't help but notice the study earlier, so many books. Do you read much? George's expression flickered for a split second before he composed himself. Occasionally. Business documents take up most of my time. Linda made a mental note of his reaction. He was on edge, no matter how much he tried to hide it. After dinner, Linda excused herself and returned to her room, pretending to retire early. Once again, she waited until the house was silent. This time, she wasn't going to Julia's room. She needed to take a bigger risk. Clutching a flashlight, Linda made her way to the basement, a part of the house she hadn't explored yet. The door was old and creaked loudly as she pushed it open. She hesitated, listening for any signs that someone might have heard her, but the mansion remained still. The basement was cold and damp, illuminated only by the beam of her flashlight. Boxes and old furniture were stacked haphazardly, but Linda's attention was drawn to a locked cabinet in the corner. It was sturdy, with a heavy padlock securing it. She knelt beside it and pulled the small pouch of tools from her handbag. Her hands trembled as she worked to pick the lock, the sound of the metal scraping unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. Finally, the lock gave way with a soft click. Linda opened the cabinet, her breath catching as she saw its contents. Inside were vials of liquids and packets of powders, all carefully labeled with medical terms she didn't fully understand. Alongside them were documents, ledgers detailing the purchase of these substances, with George's signature on each transaction. As she sifted through the papers, her stomach churned. One of the documents was a report on a substance that caused gradual weakness and confusion in its victims. It described symptoms identical to Julia's condition. Linda photographed everything, her heart pounding with every snap of the camera. Just as she was about to close the cabinet, she heard footsteps above her. Her blood turned cold. Someone was in the hallway above, moving toward the basement door. Linda quickly locked the cabinet and extinguished her flashlight, hiding behind a stack of boxes. The basement door creaked open, and dim light spilled down the stairs. Linda held her breath as the footsteps descended slowly, deliberately. She could just make out the silhouette of Jessica, holding a lantern. The housekeeper scanned the room, her eyes sharp and searching. Linda's heart pounded so loudly she was sure Jessica could hear it. She pressed herself tighter against the boxes, praying she wouldn't be seen. After what felt like an eternity, Jessica turned and climbed back up the stairs, closing the door behind her. Linda waited several minutes before daring to move. Her hands were shaking as she crept out of the basement and back to her room. She locked the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to steady her breathing. She reviewed the photos again, her determination solidifying. She couldn't wait any longer. Julia's life was in imminent danger, and Linda needed to act. The plan began to form in her mind. She would get Julia out of the house that very night. But she couldn't do it alone. Linda decided it was time to fully trust Charles. Linda knew the risk of waiting any longer. As the clock struck midnight, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out of her room, clutching the pouch of evidence. Her steps were careful, each one muffled by the thick carpet in the hallway. The mansion was eerily silent, but every creak of the floorboards underfoot made her heart race. Her first stop was the gardener's quarters, a small building tucked behind the mansion near the edge of the property. The crisp night air stung her skin as she moved quickly through the garden, her eyes darting to every shadow. When she reached Charles's door, she knocked softly, praying he was awake. A few moments later, the door opened slightly, and Charles appeared, his face weary but alert. His expression shifted to concern when he saw Linda's urgency. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. Linda entered, clutching his arm. "I need your help, Charles. Tonight. Julia's in danger, and I don't think she'll survive another day in that house." Charles nodded without hesitation. "Tell me what to do." Linda quickly laid out her plan. "I've gathered evidence of what George and Jessica have been doing, poisoning Julia to take her fortune. I need to get her out of that house, but I'll need you to distract them while I get her to safety." Charles's jaw tightened. "I've seen how they treat her, ma'am. It's wrong. I'll help you any way I can." The plan was simple but risky. Charles would set a small fire in the tool shed near the house to draw George and Jessica outside. While they were distracted, Linda would enter Julia's room and take her to the car Linda had borrowed from a neighbor earlier that day, parked discreetly at the edge of the property. With the plan in motion, Linda and Charles parted ways. As Linda approached the house, her pulse quickened. She entered quietly through the kitchen door, which Charles had left slightly ajar for her. Inside, the house felt even more oppressive than before, the walls seeming to close in around her. Linda made her way upstairs, her ears straining for any sound. When she reached Julia's room, she found her daughter still lying on the bed, her breaths shallow. Linda gently shook her awake. "Julia, sweetheart, it's me," she whispered. "We're leaving. You're going to be safe now." Julia's eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. "Mom," she murmured weakly. "Yes, it's me. I'm here to help you." "We have to go now," Linda said, her voice trembling with urgency. With great effort, Linda helped Julia sit up and wrapped her in a blanket. Her daughter was frail, her body almost weightless as Linda guided her to her feet. They moved slowly, Linda supporting Julia's every step as they made their way down the dimly lit hallway. Outside, the sound of crackling flames erupted as Charles's distraction began. Moments later, Linda heard George's angry voice echo through the house. "What's going on out there?" he barked. Jessica's hurried footsteps followed. "It's the shed. I'll fetch water." Linda used the commotion to her advantage, quickening her pace toward the kitchen door. As they reached it, Julia stumbled, her strength fading. Linda held her close, whispering reassurances. "You're almost there, Julia. Just a little further." They stepped out into the cool night, the flames from the tool shed illuminating the garden. Charles was throwing buckets of water onto the fire, shouting loudly to keep George and Jessica occupied. Linda led Julia toward the car, the vehicle hidden behind a line of trees. Just as they reached it, Linda heard a shout from behind. "Stop!" She turned to see George standing at the edge of the garden, his face twisted with fury. He began to run toward them, but Charles stepped in his path, blocking his way. "You're not going anywhere near them," Charles said firmly, his voice steady despite George's size and aggression. George shoved Charles aside, but the delay was enough. Linda helped Julia into the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. As the car sped away, Linda glanced in the rearview mirror. George was shouting, his figure shrinking as they put distance between themselves and the mansion. Julia rested her head against the window, her eyes closing as exhaustion overtook her. Linda's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she whispered to herself, "You're safe now, my love. I promise." But Linda knew this wasn't the end. The fight was just beginning. The car's headlights cut through the darkness as Linda sped down the winding road, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The mansion, with all its secrets and horrors, was now a distant silhouette in the rearview mirror. Julia sat slumped in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow but steady. Linda glanced at her daughter, her heart breaking at how frail she looked. Julia's once vibrant features were pale, and her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Mom, where are we going?" "To safety," Linda said firmly, her voice soft but resolute. I won't let them hurt you anymore. The roads were eerily empty, the silence broken only by the hum of the car engine. Linda navigated carefully, her eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, half expecting to see George's car chasing them. She couldn't shake the image of his furious face as they had driven away. After about an hour, Linda pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of a quiet town. The flickering neon sign above the station cast a pale light over the empty lot. She parked near the entrance and gently shook Julia awake. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll be right back," Linda said, tucking the blanket around her daughter before stepping out into the cool night air. Inside the station, the cashier, a young man with a bored expression, looked up from his magazine as Linda approached. "Can I use your phone?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. The man shrugged and pointed to an old payphone in the corner. Linda fished some coins from her purse and dialed the number of the neighbor who had lent her the car. The call connected after a few rings. "Mrs. Peterson? It's Linda. I need your help. We've left the mansion, but Julia's not well. Do you know a safe place nearby where I can take her?" Mrs. Peterson's voice was calm and reassuring. "There's a small clinic in town that's open late. The doctor there is trustworthy. I'll send you the address." Relieved, Linda thanked her and hung up. She quickly bought a bottle of water and a small packet of crackers before returning to the car. Julia stirred as Linda helped her take a sip of water. "We're going to see a doctor, sweetheart. He'll help you feel better," she said, her voice soothing. Linda started the car again and followed the directions Mrs. Peterson had sent. The clinic was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street. Its warm, yellow lights spilled out onto the pavement, a beacon of hope in the dark night. Inside, the receptionist took one look at Julia and immediately called for the doctor. Within moments, a kind-faced man in his 60s appeared, his calm demeanor putting Linda at ease. "Mrs. Linda? I'm Dr. Morales. Let's take a look at your daughter," he said gently, leading them into a small examination room. Julia was laid on the examination table, and Linda explained everything, the mysterious tea, the pills, the strange symptoms that had begun months ago. Dr. Morales listened intently, nodding as he examined Julia. After running a few quick tests, he turned to Linda with a grave expression. "Your suspicions are correct. Julia's symptoms indicate prolonged exposure to a toxic substance. It's a slow-acting poison, likely administered in small doses over time. But the good news is, we've caught it in time. With treatment, she can recover." Linda's knees almost buckled with relief. She grasped the doctor's hand tightly. "Thank you, Dr. Morales. Please, do whatever it takes to help her." As Julia was given an IV drip to flush the toxins from her system, Linda sat by her bedside, stroking her hair. For the first time in months, Julia's face seemed to relax, her breathing becoming steadier. But Linda knew they weren't safe yet. George and Jessica wouldn't let Julia go so easily, not when her fortune was at stake. Linda leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She needed to ensure that they could never harm Julia, or anyone else, again. She pulled out her phone and reviewed the photos she had taken, her resolve hardening. The evidence was strong, but she needed to act quickly. Tomorrow, she would take it to the police and expose everything. For now, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace, watching Julia finally begin to rest. The night outside remained quiet, but Linda knew the storm was far from over. The soft hum of the clinic's machines was a stark contrast to the chaos that Linda had left behind at the mansion. Julia lay peacefully, her complexion slowly regaining warmth as the IV drip delivered the medication her body desperately needed. Linda, sitting by her side, refused to let go of her daughter's hand. The night stretched on, and Linda remained vigilant. She couldn't allow herself to rest yet. The threat of George and Jessica loomed large in her mind. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the clinic's curtains, Linda's phone buzzed softly. It was Mrs. Peterson. "I've spoken to the sheriff," Mrs. Peterson said. "He's expecting you this morning. Bring everything you have." "Thank you," Linda replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'll make sure they pay for what they've done." Linda turned to Dr. Morales, who entered the room with a clipboard. "She's stable now," the doctor said with a reassuring smile. "But she'll need rest and continued treatment to fully recover." "You've done well, Mrs. Linda." "If you'd waited any longer," he didn't finish the sentence, but Linda understood. She nodded, squeezing Julia's hand. "I won't let anything happen to her." Linda made arrangements with the clinic for Julia to stay under Dr. Morales's care while she went to the sheriff's office. Julia stirred weakly as Linda kissed her forehead. "I'll be back soon, my love," she whispered. With her bag of evidence securely in hand, Linda headed to the sheriff's office in the heart of the small town. The building was modest, with a flagpole standing proudly in front and a sign that read "Sheriff's Department" in faded letters. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet but purposeful. Sheriff Douglas, a sturdy man in his late 50s with a calm but authoritative demeanor, greeted Linda in his office. "Mrs. Linda, I've been briefed on your situation." "Let's see what you've got," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Linda pulled out her phone and showed him the photos she had taken, the documents in George's study, the substances in the basement cabinet, and the notes detailing the poisoning's effects. She also handed over the small vial and packet she had taken from Jessica's tray. The sheriff examined the evidence carefully, his brow furrowing. "This is serious. If these substances match what's in your daughter's system, we'll have more than enough to arrest George and Jessica. You've done the hard part, Mrs. Linda." Linda's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I just want them stopped. They've already done enough harm." The sheriff nodded and leaned back in his chair. "We'll handle it from here. I'll send a deputy to secure your daughter at the clinic, just in case. And we'll head to the mansion to apprehend them." Relief washed over Linda, but it was tinged with apprehension. "Be careful," she said. "They're manipulative and dangerous." The sheriff gave a small, reassuring smile. "We'll be ready." Linda left the office feeling a weight lift from her shoulders, though her mind was still racing. She returned to the clinic to check on Julia and found her awake, her eyes tired but more focused than before. "Mom," Julia said softly, her voice still weak. I thought I was dreaming last night. But you're really here." Linda sat by her side, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm here, sweetheart. And I'll always be here. No one will ever hurt you again." Julia nodded, her hand clutching Linda's. "I don't remember much. Just, the tea. Jessica always brought it. And George, he said it was to help me relax. I trusted them." "You don't have to worry about them anymore," Linda said, stroking Julia's hair. "The sheriff is going to make sure they pay for what they've done." Later that day, Linda received a call from Sheriff Douglas. His tone was measured but firm. "Mrs. Linda, we've apprehended George and Jessica. They tried to deny everything at first, but the evidence speaks for itself. They'll be facing charges for attempted murder and fraud." Linda closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of closure. "They won't hurt anyone else," the sheriff continued. "You've done a brave thing, Mrs. Linda. Your daughter is alive because of you." As Linda hung up, she returned to Julia's room, feeling a wave of gratitude. She sat beside her daughter, holding her hand once more. "You're safe now," she said, her voice steady with determination. "We're free." But deep inside, Linda knew the scars of this ordeal would take time to heal. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope on the horizon. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clinic's windows with soft amber hues, Linda sat by Julia's bedside, watching the gentle rise and fall of her daughter's chest. Julia had fallen asleep again, her body slowly recovering from the poison that had coursed through her veins for so long. Though relief had begun to settle in Linda's heart, her mind remained restless. A knock at the door startled her. Dr. Morales entered quietly, a folder in his hands. His face was calm but serious. "Mrs. Linda," he began, pulling up a chair. "I wanted to give you an update on Julia's condition." Linda leaned forward, clutching her hands together. "How is she? Will she recover completely?" Dr. Morales nodded, offering a small smile. "She's on the right track. The toxins in her system are being flushed out, and she's responding well to the treatment. However, her body has been under significant stress for months. It will take time for her strength to return fully, and she'll need ongoing care." Linda exhaled, a mixture of relief and worry washing over her. "I'll do whatever it takes. As long as she's safe." "She is safe," Dr. Morales reassured her. "And I've spoken with the sheriff. They've already started their investigation into George and Jessica. You've done everything you could, Mrs. Linda. The worst is behind you now." Linda nodded, though deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. Shadows of doubt lingered, whispers of the horrors they had escaped. That night, after Julia had been given another dose of medication and had drifted into a deep sleep, Linda decided to step outside for some air. The crisp night breeze carried the faint scent of pine, and the stars above seemed brighter in the absence of city lights. As she stood near the clinic's small garden, footsteps approached from behind. Linda turned to see Charles walking toward her, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Charles," Linda said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I didn't expect to see you here." He removed his hat and smiled softly. "I couldn't just go home, ma'am. Not until I knew you and Miss Julia were all right." Linda's eyes welled up with tears. "You were brave, Charles. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." Charles shifted uncomfortably, his modesty evident. "You're the brave one, Mrs. Linda. I just did what was right." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past few days heavy between them. "George and Jessica," Charles finally said, breaking the quiet. "Do you think they'll ever be able to hurt anyone again?" Linda shook her head, her resolve hardening. "No. The sheriff has them in custody, and the evidence is overwhelming. They won't escape justice." Charles nodded, his shoulders relaxing. "Good. They deserve everything that's coming to them." Before leaving, Charles placed a gentle hand on Linda's shoulder. "If you or Miss Julia ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. I mean it." Linda smiled, touched by his sincerity. "Thank you, Charles. Truly." As he walked away, Linda returned to the clinic, her heart lighter but still cautious. Inside, Julia stirred in her sleep, her face calm for the first time in weeks. Linda sat beside her once more, taking her hand and whispering softly, "We're going to get through this, Julia. Together." But even as the quiet moments passed, Linda's instincts remained sharp. She had learned not to trust the appearance of peace, not when the darkness they had escaped felt so close behind. The next morning, Linda awoke to find Julia sitting up in bed, looking at her with tired but alert eyes. "Mom," Julia said, her voice hoarse but stronger than before. "You stayed with me all night?" Linda smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Julia's face. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll always be here." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved me." "You don't have to thank me," Linda said firmly. "You're my daughter. I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat." A nurse entered the room, carrying a tray of breakfast and fresh water. "Good morning, Miss Julia. It's good to see you awake and looking better." Julia managed a small smile, though her eyes still held traces of vulnerability. "Thank you." As Julia ate, Linda went to speak with Dr. Morales again. She needed to plan their next steps, ensuring Julia had everything she needed for her recovery. But Linda also knew that George and Jessica's arrest wasn't the end. Questions lingered. How long had they been planning this? Were others involved? The mansion had been full of secrets, there might be more threads to unravel. For now, though, Linda focused on one thing, Julia's recovery. The storm had passed, but rebuilding their lives would take time. The morning light streamed softly through the clinic's window, bathing Julia's room in a warm glow. She sat propped up in bed, her fragile frame wrapped in a soft blanket. Linda was at her side, holding her hand as she sipped tea, a semblance of peace finally settling over them. But beneath the calm exterior, Linda's mind was far from still. As Julia drifted back to sleep after breakfast, Linda decided to take a walk to clear her head. Outside the clinic, she paced along the garden's edge, the faint scent of blooming flowers doing little to ease the weight pressing on her. George and Jessica were in custody, but the questions surrounding their motives gnawed at her. Had they acted alone? Was this purely about greed, or was there more at play? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. She turned to see Sheriff Douglas stepping out of his cruiser. He removed his hat as he approached, his expression calm but serious. "Good morning, Mrs. Linda," he said, offering a respectful nod. "Sheriff," Linda replied, her voice steady despite the tension building inside her. "Any updates?" Douglas sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his work. "We've started going through the mansion, cataloging everything. It's clear George and Jessica planned this for a long time. We found more evidence in the study, letters, financial records, and even documents suggesting they'd already started transferring assets into George's name." Linda's jaw tightened. "I knew it. They were poisoning her to weaken her, to make her doubt herself." "That's not all," the sheriff continued, his tone dropping. "We found correspondence between George and a man named Vincent Delacroix. Do you recognize the name?" Linda's brows furrowed as she tried to recall. "No, who is he?" "From what we can tell, Delacroix is a lawyer, but his reputation is questionable," the sheriff explained. "He specializes in shady estate dealings. It looks like George was planning to use him to fast-track control over Julia's assets." The revelation sent a chill down Linda's spine. "Do you think Delacroix is involved in more than just the paperwork?" "We're looking into it," Douglas assured her. "But if George was working with him, it's possible this scheme goes deeper than we thought. I wanted to let you know, in case you notice anything unusual." Linda's instinct to protect Julia flared anew. "I'll keep my eyes open, Sheriff. Thank you for telling me." Douglas nodded. "One more thing. We've posted a deputy outside the clinic, just in case. I don't think anyone will try anything, but I'd rather be cautious." Linda felt a pang of gratitude. "That means a lot. Thank you." As the sheriff left, Linda returned to Julia's room, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let her guard down, not while questions remained unanswered. Later that day, as Julia rested, Linda sifted through the photos she had taken at the mansion, searching for connections she might have missed. One document caught her attention, a letter addressed to George, written in cold, precise language. It referenced an arrangement and mentioned a sum of money that had already been exchanged. Linda's eyes narrowed. Whoever had written this letter was likely a key player in the conspiracy. She decided to show it to the sheriff the next morning. That evening, as Linda sat by Julia's bedside, a nurse entered with a cautious expression. "Mrs. Linda," she said softly. "There's a man here asking about Miss Julia. He says he's a family friend, but he didn't give his name." Linda's heart leapt with alarm. "Where is he now?" "He's speaking with the deputy outside," the nurse replied. Linda rose immediately, her instincts on high alert. She stepped into the hallway and walked toward the clinic's entrance, where she saw a tall, sharply dressed man speaking animatedly with the deputy. His face was unfamiliar, but the way his eyes darted around suggested he wasn't there out of genuine concern. "Can I help you?" Linda asked, her voice firm as she approached. The man turned to her, his expression shifting to a practiced smile. "Ah, you must be Mrs. Linda. My name is Vincent Delacroix. I'm here on behalf of Mr. George. He asked me to check on Julia's condition." Linda's blood ran cold, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she stood taller, her gaze piercing. "Julia is fine, and she doesn't need anything from George, or you." Delacroix chuckled lightly, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I understand your concern, but this is merely a formality. Mr. George still has certain legal rights." "George has nothing," Linda interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And if you think you're going to intimidate me or my daughter, you're sorely mistaken." The deputy stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Mr. Delacroix, I think it's time for you to leave." Delacroix raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need for hostility. I was just doing my job." He turned to Linda, his smile now a thin veneer. "But I'll be in touch. Good evening, Mrs. Linda." As he walked away, Linda felt a surge of anger and resolve. She turned to the deputy. "Make sure he doesn't come back." The deputy nodded. "We'll keep a close watch, ma'am. Don't worry." But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. Delacroix's appearance confirmed her fears. George's reach extended further than she had imagined. That night, as the clinic settled into quiet, Linda stayed awake by Julia's side, her mind racing with plans to protect her daughter. If the storm was returning, Linda would be ready to fight. Linda didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Vincent Delacroix's cold smile haunted her. She sat by Julia's bed, her mind racing with questions. How much did Delacroix know? What would his next move be? More importantly, how could she protect Julia from this lingering shadow? The following morning, Linda met with Sheriff Douglas at his office. The unease from Delacroix's visit lingered, and she wasted no time in addressing her concerns. "Sheriff, Vincent Delacroix came to the clinic last night," Linda said, her tone sharp. "He claimed he was there on George's behalf, but I don't believe for a second that his intentions were harmless." Douglas frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "Delacroix is slippery, but if he's making appearances, it means he's nervous. We'll dig deeper into his connection with George and this arrangement you found in the documents." Linda placed the photograph of the letter she had discovered on the desk. "This mentions money being exchanged. It's proof that someone else was involved in this scheme, and I'm sure Delacroix knows more than he's letting on." The sheriff nodded, his expression grim. "You're probably right. I'll have my team investigate this further. In the meantime, I'll keep a deputy stationed at the clinic. We'll make sure no one gets near Julia." "Thank you," Linda said, though the knot of worry in her stomach didn't loosen. As Linda left the office, she saw Charles waiting outside. He had driven into town after hearing about Delacroix's visit. His presence, steady and dependable, gave Linda a moment of relief. "I heard what happened," Charles said, his voice low. "If Delacroix is sniffing around, it means he's desperate." Linda sighed, the tension evident in her features. Desperate men can be dangerous. "I need to keep Julia safe while the sheriff digs into this." Charles nodded. "Whatever you need, ma'am. I'm here to help." Back at the clinic, Linda returned to Julia's room, where her daughter was awake and sipping tea. Julia's color had improved slightly, though the weakness in her frame was still evident. "Mom," Julia said softly as Linda sat beside her. "You look tired. You've been worrying too much." Linda smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Julia's face. "Mothers never stop worrying, sweetheart. But you're looking better, and that's what matters." Julia reached for Linda's hand, her grip light but reassuring. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how you did it, but you saved me. I'll always protect you, Linda said, her voice firm. The moment of calm was interrupted by a knock at the door. The deputy stationed outside stepped in, his expression serious. Mrs. Linda, he said. Sheriff Douglas called. He found something you should know about. Linda felt her pulse quicken as she followed the deputy to the clinic's small waiting area. Sheriff Douglas was on the line, his voice crackling over the speakerphone. Mrs. Linda, he began. We've uncovered financial records tied to George. It looks like he was funneling money into an offshore account under Delacroix's name. But here's the strange part, there's a third name linked to these transactions. A woman named Evelyn Graves. Does that name mean anything to you? Linda's breath caught. The name was familiar, though it took her a moment to place it. Evelyn Graves, she was George's secretary years ago. She left suddenly, and Julia mentioned once that it was odd how quickly George replaced her. Douglas's tone sharpened. We're working on locating her. If she's involved, she might be the missing piece to this puzzle. Stay on guard, Mrs. Linda. I'll update you as soon as we know more. As the call ended, Linda turned to the deputy. Keep an eye on everyone coming and going. If Evelyn Graves is involved, she might make an appearance. The rest of the day passed in tense quiet. Julia rested, her strength slowly returning, while Linda kept a watchful eye on the clinic's surroundings. Every unfamiliar face, every shadow seemed to carry a threat. That evening, as Linda sat by the window in Julia's room, she noticed a figure lingering near the clinic's entrance. The street lamp's glow illuminated a woman with dark hair and sharp features. She was dressed in a tailored coat, her posture confident but tense. Linda's instincts kicked in. She stepped into the hallway and motioned for the deputy. There's someone outside, she said in a hushed voice. She doesn't look like she belongs here. The deputy nodded, heading toward the entrance. Linda watched from a distance as he approached the woman, speaking to her briefly. The woman's expression shifted, first composed, then slightly anxious, before she turned and walked briskly away. When the deputy returned, Linda was waiting. Who was she? She said her name was Evelyn Graves, the deputy replied. Claimed she was here to check on Julia but left as soon as I started asking questions. Linda's heart pounded. Evelyn Graves was closer than they'd thought, and her appearance confirmed one thing, the conspiracy wasn't over. As the night deepened, Linda sat by Julia's bedside once more, her hand resting on her daughter's. The battle wasn't finished, but Linda's resolve had never been stronger. She would see this through to the end, no matter what it took. The clinic felt more like a fortress than a haven now. Linda paced the room while Julia slept, the soft rhythm of her daughter's breathing the only sound grounding her. Evelyn Graves' unexpected appearance had reignited Linda's vigilance. It was clear Evelyn wasn't there out of concern for Julia. She had come with an agenda, and Linda needed to uncover what it was before it was too late. The next morning, Sheriff Douglas arrived at the clinic, his presence bringing a sense of urgency. He carried a folder filled with documents, and his expression was as serious as Linda had ever seen it. We need to talk, he said, ushering Linda into a small meeting room near the reception area. Linda sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. You found something. Douglas opened the folder, spreading the papers across the table. We traced Evelyn Graves' movements over the last few years. She disappeared after leaving George's company but resurfaced recently under a different name, working as a consultant for Vincent Delacroix. Linda's breath hitched. She's been part of this from the beginning. Likely, Douglas confirmed. She was probably the one managing the financial transfers behind the scenes, keeping everything under the radar. He slid another document toward Linda. This is where it gets interesting. Evelyn booked a flight 2 days ago, destination, a small island with no extradition treaty. She's planning to run. Linda's mind raced. If she's running, she knows the walls are closing in. Exactly, Douglas said. But she hasn't left yet. We have a narrow window to bring her in and get her to talk. If she cooperates, she could give us the evidence we need to seal George and Delacroix's fates. Linda felt a surge of determination. What can I do? Douglas hesitated. Evelyn seems cautious but desperate. If she sees an opportunity to escape, she'll take it. We need to lure her out, convince her that it's safer to come to us than to keep running. Linda frowned, the weight of the request sinking in. You want to use Julia? The sheriff shook his head. Not directly. But Evelyn seems fixated on Julia's recovery. We think she might come closer if she believes she can use Julia to negotiate her way out. You'd need to be there, to convince her to talk. Linda's protective instincts flared, but she forced herself to think rationally. If this will put an end to all of it, I'll do it. But only if Julia stays safe. Douglas nodded. We'll control the situation. The clinic is secure, and deputies will be stationed at every entrance. Evelyn won't get close unless we let her. Later that day, the plan was set into motion. Deputies discreetly patrolled the perimeter, and Linda returned to Julia's room, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. Julia, though still weak, sensed her mother's tension. Mom, Julia said softly, her voice laced with concern. What's going on? You've been on edge all day. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, brushing Julia's hand with her own. There's just a lot happening, sweetheart. But don't worry. I'm taking care of everything. Julia looked into her mother's eyes, her expression filled with trust. I know you are. You always do. Hours passed, the tension in the clinic building like a taut string. As night fell, a figure approached the clinic's entrance. It was Evelyn Graves, her silhouette sharp under the glow of the street lamp. Deputies were positioned out of sight, ready to act if needed. Linda, her heart pounding, stepped into the waiting area as Evelyn entered. The woman's expression was cautious but controlled, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Linda. Mrs. Linda, Evelyn said, her voice smooth but wary. I was hoping we could speak privately. Linda stood tall, her voice steady. If you have something to say, you can say it here. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not your enemy. George and Delacroix, they're the ones you should be worried about. I was just a pawn in their scheme. A pawn? Linda shot back, her tone sharp. You handled their money. You helped poison my daughter. Don't pretend you're innocent. Evelyn flinched but recovered quickly. I didn't know what they were planning at first. By the time I realized, I was in too deep. George doesn't just cut ties, he eliminates loose ends. Linda narrowed her eyes. And now you're trying to save yourself. Yes, Evelyn admitted, her voice faltering. But I can help you. I have documents, communications that prove everything. If you let me walk away, I'll give you everything you need to take them down. Linda hesitated, her mind racing. Why should I trust you? Because if you don't, George and Delacroix will keep coming for Julia, Evelyn said, her voice urgent. They won't stop until they've won. Before Linda could respond, Sheriff Douglas stepped out from his hiding spot, his presence commanding. Ms. Graves, you're not in a position to negotiate. If you have evidence, you'll hand it over, now. Evelyn's confidence wavered as two deputies moved closer, blocking the exit. Realizing she was trapped, she exhaled sharply and reached into her bag, pulling out a USB drive. This has everything, she said, her voice tight. Emails, financial records, even voice recordings. Douglas took the drive, his eyes narrowing. We'll see if that's true. In the meantime, you're coming with us. Evelyn didn't resist as the deputies escorted her out. Linda watched, her emotions a storm of relief, anger, and exhaustion. As the clinic returned to quiet, Linda sank into a chair, her body trembling with the weight of the night's events. The evidence on the drive would be the key to ending this nightmare, but for now, she focused on one thing: Julia was safe. And Linda would make sure she stayed that way. The clinic returned to an uneasy calm after Evelyn Graves was taken into custody. Linda, exhausted but resolute, remained by Julia's side. Her daughter's health was steadily improving, but Linda's mind refused to rest. She knew the USB drive Evelyn handed over could be the key to unraveling the full extent of George and Delacroix's scheme. The next morning, Sheriff Douglas called Linda with an update. His tone carried a mix of satisfaction and caution. "Mrs. Linda, the USB drive Evelyn provided checks out. It's a treasure trove of evidence, emails detailing how George coordinated Julia's poisoning, financial records linking Delacroix to offshore accounts, and even a few voice recordings of their conversations. This is more than enough to bring them down." Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So, it's over." "Almost," Douglas said. "We still need to confirm a few details, but Evelyn's cooperation strengthens the case. However, there's one troubling piece. The recordings mention a final step George had planned. It seems he was preparing for Julia to disappear entirely, claiming she'd gone on a retreat. They were planning to move her to a facility far from here, one they could control." Linda's stomach turned. The thought of Julia being completely at George's mercy chilled her to the bone. "Thank God we stopped them." "We did," Douglas affirmed. "But we're not taking any chances. I'll keep my deputies stationed at the clinic until this is fully resolved." Later that day, Linda shared the news with Julia. Her daughter, though visibly shaken, managed a weak smile. "They were never going to stop, were they?" Julia said softly. "No," Linda replied, her voice firm. "But they underestimated us. It's over now. You're safe." Julia's hand tightened around Linda's. "Because of you, Mom. You never gave up." Linda brushed a strand of hair from Julia's face, her heart swelling with both love and fierce determination. "I would do it all again, 1,000 times, if it meant keeping you safe." While Julia rested, Linda took a moment to reflect. The ordeal had pushed her to her limits, but it had also revealed her strength, a strength born of love and an unwavering sense of justice. As the day wore on, the clinic received another visitor. Sheriff Douglas arrived in person, a laptop in hand. He asked Linda to join him in the meeting room. "We've decoded the drive," Douglas began, opening the laptop. "There's something I want you to hear." He clicked on an audio file. A distorted voice, George's, played through the speakers. "We'll move her next week. Once she's out of sight, we'll finalize the transfers. Jessica has everything under control here. No loose ends." A second voice, smoother and more calculated, replied. It was Delacroix. "And if her mother interferes?" George's reply was cold. "We'll handle her. Permanently, if necessary." Linda felt a chill run through her. She had known George was capable of cruelty, but hearing his calculated tone, his willingness to harm her, cemented just how dangerous he was. Douglas paused the recording, his expression grim. "This confirms their intent. They were prepared to do whatever it took to achieve their goals." Linda's voice was steady, though anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. "They underestimated me. And now they'll face the consequences." Douglas nodded. "We'll use this in court. Between this and the financial evidence, they don't stand a chance." As the sheriff left, Linda returned to Julia's room. She sat beside her daughter, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing as she slept. The clinic staff brought in dinner for Linda, but she barely touched it. Her thoughts were consumed by the fight ahead. Though George and Delacroix were in custody, the upcoming trial would likely bring more revelations, more attempts to manipulate and twist the truth. That night, Linda lay awake in the small cot provided for her in Julia's room. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of the countless battles she had fought over the past weeks. This was the final stretch, she told herself. But as the hours dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Evelyn's sudden cooperation, though genuine, hinted at her desperation. And George's chilling words in the recording suggested that not all of his plans had been uncovered. The storm, it seemed, hadn't fully passed. As Linda drifted into a restless sleep, she resolved to remain vigilant. She would see this through to the end, for Julia, for herself, and for the justice they both deserved. The trial date for George and Vincent Delacroix was set a week later, a time that moved at once too quickly and too slowly for Linda. The clinic remained a sanctuary, with Julia's condition steadily improving. Yet Linda couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't entirely won. Sheriff Douglas visited frequently to update Linda on the case. He shared that Evelyn Graves had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony would strengthen the prosecution's case against George and Delacroix, exposing the intricate web of deceit they had spun. But even with the evidence piling up, Linda couldn't let her guard down. One night, as Linda sat by Julia's bed, reviewing her own notes and photos from the mansion, Julia stirred. Her voice, still soft but stronger than before, broke the silence. "Mom, do you think they'll get away with it?" Julia asked, her eyes clouded with worry. Linda reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "No, sweetheart. They've been exposed. The truth is on our side." "But George, he's always been so good at hiding things," Julia whispered. "I didn't see it until it was too late." Linda's heart ached at the guilt in her daughter's voice. "None of this is your fault. You trusted him because you're kind and open-hearted. That's not a weakness, it's his. He used that trust to try to take everything from you. But he underestimated both of us." Julia's lips curled into a faint smile. "Because you fought for me." Linda leaned forward, brushing Julia's hair away from her face. "Always. And I'll keep fighting until this is over." The next morning, Linda received a call from Sheriff Douglas. His tone was brisk, laced with urgency. "Mrs. Linda, we've uncovered something new," he said. "I need you to come to the station." Linda's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Just come down here." "It's important," Douglas replied. At the station, Douglas escorted Linda to his office, where a series of documents were spread across his desk. Among them was a handwritten letter in a sharp, slanted script. "This was found in Delacroix's private files," Douglas explained. "It's addressed to Evelyn Graves. Take a look." Linda scanned the letter. It was brief, but its message was chilling. "Evelyn. If things go south, make sure the contingency plan is executed. We can't afford to leave loose ends. You know what needs to be done." Gee. Linda looked up, her blood running cold. "What does he mean by contingency plan?" Douglas sighed, his face grim. "We're not sure yet, but given everything we know, it's likely another attempt to secure Julia's assets, or worse." "Worse?" Linda's voice rose, panic creeping in. "We're investigating," Douglas assured her. "But it means we can't let our guard down, not until the trial concludes and they're sentenced. George's connections are extensive, and he might still have allies willing to act on his behalf." Linda's mind raced. She had thought they'd finally cornered George, but this new revelation proved just how deeply his schemes ran. "What do we do now?" "We've increased security at the clinic and are monitoring all known associates of George and Delacroix," Douglas said. "But I need you to stay vigilant, Mrs. Linda. If you notice anything, anyone suspicious, call me immediately." That evening, Linda returned to the clinic, her nerves frayed. As she approached Julia's room, she noticed the deputy on duty speaking to a nurse. His body language was calm, but Linda's instincts prickled. She caught a glimpse of the nurse's face, sharp features, calculating eyes. Linda froze, her heart pounding. She didn't recognize the woman. Was she new? Or was this George's contingency plan in motion? Linda approached carefully, her voice steady. "Excuse me, are you part of the night shift?" The nurse turned, her expression neutral but watchful. "Yes, ma'am. I just started yesterday. I was assigned to assist with Miss Julia's care." Linda forced a smile. "Thank you for letting me know. What's your name?" The nurse hesitated, just briefly. "Rebecca," she said finally. Linda nodded, filing the name away. She entered Julia's room and locked the door behind her, her mind racing. After Julia drifted to sleep, Linda made a call to Sheriff Douglas. "There's a new nurse here," Linda whispered, her voice low. "She said her name is Rebecca, but something feels off about her. Can you check her background?" "I'll look into it right away," Douglas replied. The night passed slowly, Linda's eyes never leaving the door. When morning came, Douglas called back. "Mrs. Linda, we verified the clinic staff records. There's no nurse named Rebecca employed there." The words hit Linda like a thunderclap. "She's here, Sheriff. Right now. Stay with Julia," Douglas ordered. "I'm sending deputies immediately." Linda locked the door again, her body trembling as she moved to Julia's side. She sat close, her hand gripping Julia's as the minutes ticked by like hours. When the sound of approaching footsteps reached the hallway, Linda's breath caught. A firm knock came at the door. "Mrs. Linda, it's the sheriff," a voice called. Linda opened the door cautiously, her relief flooding out as she saw Douglas and two deputies. The supposed nurse, Rebecca, was nowhere in sight. "She's gone," Linda said, her voice shaking. "We'll find her," Douglas promised, his eyes hard. Linda glanced back at Julia, who remained blissfully unaware of the danger she had been in. Whatever George's contingency plan was, it had just failed. But Linda knew they hadn't seen the last of his schemes. Not yet. The tension at the clinic reached an all-time high after the mysterious nurse vanished. Deputies swarmed the building, conducting a thorough search, but Rebecca was nowhere to be found. Sheriff Douglas remained calm but determined, issuing orders to tighten security and expand the search for the imposter. Linda, however, couldn't shake the dread that lingered in her chest. Someone had gotten too close to Julia, too close to the truth. George's contingency plan had failed this time, but what if they tried again? That night, as the clinic settled into a restless quiet, Linda sat by Julia's bed, her mind racing. She had been so focused on protecting her daughter that she hadn't stopped to consider the danger she herself might be in. If George couldn't get to Julia, would he come after her instead? Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. It was Sheriff Douglas. He stepped inside, his expression grim but steady. "We've identified the nurse," he said quietly. "Her real name is Karen Milner. She's worked with Delacroix before, part of his network of fixers. She was likely here to scope out the clinic, maybe even to gather information for a future attempt." Linda's fists clenched. How did she get so close? How did we let this happen? Douglas sighed. These people are professionals. They know how to blend in, how to exploit gaps in security. But we're closing in on them, Mrs. Linda. Karen won't stay hidden for long. Linda's voice was firm, though her hands trembled. You need to find her before she tries again. And before George pulls something else. We will, Douglas assured her. I've tripled the security detail here. No one's getting through without my men knowing. As the sheriff left, Linda sat back down beside Julia, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Julia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Mom, she murmured. Linda forced a smile, masking the storm of fear inside her. I'm here, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. Julia's eyes lingered on her mother for a moment, sensing the tension but too tired to press further. She drifted back into a peaceful slumber, her breathing soft and steady. Linda stayed awake through the night, her ears tuned to every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound beyond the door. Her instincts told her this wasn't over, not yet. The following morning, Linda received a call from Evelyn Graves, now cooperating fully with the authorities. Evelyn's voice was low, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Linda," Evelyn began. "I heard about what happened at the clinic. I need to tell you something." "Go on," Linda said, her voice steady. "When George and Delacroix brought me into this, they mentioned something called Operation Horizon. I didn't know much about it at the time, but from what I gathered, it was their last resort plan. If everything else failed, it would ensure they could disappear, and take Julia's assets with them." Linda's breath caught. "Do you know how they plan to execute it?" "No," Evelyn admitted. "But I know Delacroix has a safe house in the city. If they're still trying to activate this plan, that's where they'll regroup." Linda relayed the information to Sheriff Douglas, who immediately dispatched a team to investigate the safe house. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Linda remained at the clinic, her nerves on edge as she waited for news. By late afternoon, Douglas called. His voice carried both relief and determination. "We found the safe house," he said. "Delacroix wasn't there, but we recovered more documents. They were preparing fake identities, forged ownership papers for Julia's assets, and plans for an international escape route. It's over, Mrs. Linda. We've dismantled every piece of their operation." Linda exhaled deeply, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you for everything." "It's not just me," Douglas said. "You've been the driving force behind all of this. Julia is safe because of you." As Linda hung up, a sense of peace finally began to settle over her. She returned to Julia's room, sitting beside her daughter and watching as she slept. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest felt lighter. That evening, Linda stepped outside the clinic to breathe in the cool night air. The stars above seemed brighter, the world quieter. Charles appeared, his familiar, steady presence a comfort. "I heard the news," he said, leaning against the railing. "It's over, isn't it?" Linda nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "Yes. It's finally over." Charles looked at her, admiration clear in his eyes. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Linda. Not many people would have fought as hard as you did." Linda looked out into the night, her heart swelling with gratitude and exhaustion. "I didn't have a choice. Julia needed me. And when someone you love is in danger, you find strength you didn't know you had." Charles smiled softly. "She's lucky to have you." As they stood in silence, the air filled with the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves, Linda allowed herself a rare moment of calm. The battle had been long and harrowing, but she had won. And for the first time, she believed that the nightmare was truly behind them. The days that followed felt like a long-awaited exhale for Linda and Julia. The clinic, once a fortress against unseen threats, transformed into a space of healing and reflection. Julia's strength gradually returned, her cheeks regaining color and her voice growing steadier with each passing day. Linda remained by her daughter's side, never far, watching every step of her recovery. But now, for the first time in weeks, Linda allowed herself to think beyond survival. She thought of what came next, of rebuilding the life George and Delacroix had tried to destroy. One morning, as sunlight poured through the window, Julia sat up in bed, her eyes clearer than Linda had seen in months. "Mom," Julia said, her tone tentative. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" Linda paused, her heart aching at the vulnerability in Julia's voice. She sat beside her, taking Julia's hand in hers. "Normal might take time," Linda admitted. "But we'll find a new kind of normal. One where you're safe, where no one can ever hurt you again." Julia nodded, her lips curving into a small, hopeful smile. "I want that." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Sheriff Douglas entered, carrying a file under his arm. His expression was lighter than usual, a sense of finality in his posture. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted. "I have good news." Linda stood, her heart quickening. "Tell us." Douglas placed the file on the table, opening it to reveal official documents. George and Delacroix have been formally charged with attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Evelyn's testimony sealed the case, along with the evidence you gathered. They'll be facing a long time behind bars. Julia's eyes widened, her hand tightening around Linda's. "It's really over." "It's over," Douglas confirmed. "And justice will be served." Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her, tears welling up as she pulled Julia into a gentle embrace. The nightmare was finally behind them. As Douglas left, Julia leaned back against her pillows, her expression thoughtful. "Mom, I don't want to go back to that house." Linda nodded, her resolve firm. "We won't. That place holds too many dark memories. We'll sell it and start fresh somewhere new." A week later, Julia was discharged from the clinic. Charles arrived with his old pickup truck to help transport their belongings. As he loaded the last of the bags, he turned to Linda with a warm smile. "Ready for a new chapter?" he asked. Linda looked at Julia, who stood beside her, the sun catching the softness in her hair. For the first time, Linda saw confidence returning to her daughter's eyes. "Yes," Linda said, her voice steady. "We're ready." They drove to a small, quiet town several hours away, where Linda had arranged for a modest but charming home. It wasn't grand like the mansion, but it was filled with light and surrounded by gardens. Julia loved it immediately, and Linda felt peace settle into her chest as they unpacked their new life together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Julia turned to her mother. "You saved me, Mom," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how you did it, but you never gave up." Linda took Julia's hand, her heart swelling with pride and love. "Because you're my everything. And no matter what happens, I'll always fight for you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Linda felt a quiet strength fill her. They had faced the storm together and emerged stronger, ready to embrace a future built on love and resilience. For the first time in what felt like forever, Linda allowed herself to dream, not of escape, but of the bright days ahead.